For Forrestfield.
Mr Acting Speaker, what is the Parliament if not the battleground of ideals? Mr Acting Speaker, the people of Western Australia will have a clear point of difference, a very clear point of difference come 2017. A Liberal Party who are tough on law and order and community safety, or a Labor Party who are as soft as butter. I don't say these things lightly, Mr Acting Speaker, and I want to just start with some Hansard from the member for Butler. And I think I was in the chair at the time, so I do remember this towards the middle of last year, and the member for Butler... I'll get to you. I'll get to you, member for Midland. Speak up, Klingon. Speak up. Some of these backbench members of the government shout slogans. That is all they are, slogans. Liberals are tougher on law and order than Labor, always have been, always will be. I think you can remember the statement being made in this chamber, Mr Acting Speaker, referring to me, because I have made that statement in this chamber. But, Mr Acting Speaker, it's not just a slogan. And I'm going to spend the next little while articulating that argument as to why it isn't just a slogan. Any day of any week of any month, the Liberal National Government will always be tougher on crime, on law and order and crime in this state. That's why we toughen the cannabis laws. That's why we toughen the hoon laws. That's why we introduce legislation on assaults on public officers. And that's why we're going to introduce this legislation and make sure that we introduce the toughest home invasion legislation and fix the three strikes laws. The Liberal National Government will always be on the side of the victims, and will always be working to ensure less and less Western Australians become victims of crime in this state. And Mr Acting Speaker, I stand here supporting this legislation because when I get around my community and speak to people, people have been genuinely affected by the impacts of home invasions and of criminal and antisocial activity. And I won't mention this lady's name, but I was chatting to her in her house last year some stage, and she lives in High Wycombe, and she woke to find a man standing at the end of her bed with several of her household effects, I think her purse and those sorts of things. And it was only her blood-curdling scream. She lives in a tight block of apartments. It was only her blood-curdling scream, Mr Acting Speaker, that scared the offender off. But thank God for that. Of course, we know it could have worked out far worse. There's another retired couple who contacted me and said they'd been broken into for a second time, and in doing so, their dog, their animal, their pet had been hurt, and I think her wedding rings were stolen in the process, and I think all members would understand the sentimental value of those sorts of items that can't be replaced. Yet another lady who lives in Kenwick on Stretton Way who has been broken into 5 times. Last time I spoke to her, 5 times she's been broken into. She's gone to putting barbed wire around the front area of her house to try and prevent people from getting into her house, which I think is a very extreme measure that people in the streets of suburbia have to go to. People shouldn't need to live in fear, Mr Acting Speaker, particularly within the sanctity of their own home. And that's why we're going to introduce this legislation. And I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the measures that we'll go to address. The legislation mandates minimum jail terms of 75% of the maximum available for an adult offender who commits serious physical or sexual assaults in the course of a home burglary. This actually means an offender who breaks into a house and violently rapes someone will face a minimum of 15 years jail. It also means an offender who breaks into a house and seriously physically assaults someone will face a minimum of 7 years, 6 months jail. And an offender who breaks into a house and seriously indecently assaults in aggravated circumstances someone will face a minimum of 5 years and 3 months jail. It also means a 3-year mandatory minimum period of detention will apply to juveniles aged 16 and above who commit serious offences of physical or sexual violence in the course of a home invasion. And it will also address the 3 strikes law so that it isn't a series of offences isn't bundled into one strike. An offence actually means one strike. And I can say that during last year I actually had the Minister for Police out to my electorate. We met in Kenwick and met with a number of residents, and when we talked through the legislation that we were bringing forward into this Parliament to address these issues, there certainly wasn't anyone saying no, don't do it. Everyone was in strong support of a strong stance against these kinds of offenders within our community, and rightly so, I think, Mr Acting Speaker. But Mr Acting Speaker, the Labor Party has always been soft on law and order and community safety. I mean, I was sitting in here late last year listening to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and I've got his speech here somewhere. And this is the man, Mr Acting Speaker, who in a Labor government, God forbid, would be the Deputy Premier of Western Australia. And he goes on in his speech to say that the Labor Party was soft on cannabis laws a decade ago because no one knew it was harmful. No one knew it was harmful a decade ago, Mr Acting Speaker. And yet a decade ago, I was working in schools teaching teenagers about the harmful effects of marijuana and other drugs. So I'm not sure that that would be the policy that we're implementing as far as education is concerned in our public education system, and yet the Labor Party was on planet cuckoo when it came to the harmful effects of marijuana. But we shouldn't be surprised because let's go on and have a look at the person who would call himself the Attorney General in a Labor government. And we've heard plenty from him. The member for Butler, I think we need to get some oxygen readings from that side of the chamber. And when we refer to mandatory sentencing, Mr Acting Speaker, he comes in here and says, purports that he supports it and says that the Labor Party supports it, and yet when he's out of this place, when he thinks no one's watching, he actually goes on to say that mandatory sentencing is bull... ... Now, I think we've all got a big enough imagination to work out what the dots stand for, Mr Acting Speaker, so I won't say that for the purposes of Hansard. But that's really what the alternative Attorney General of Western Australia believes about mandatory sentencing in the state. Well, it's good to know that the alternative Attorney General, the person who wants to be the Attorney General of Western Australia, has got the backs of our men and women in blue. Our men and women in blue who put their lives on the line to make sure that the member for Butler can go to sleep safe at night along with his family members, and yet if they get harmed in the way of conducting their business, of making sure our streets are safe, missing in action. Missing in action. It's a disgrace, Mr Acting Speaker, an absolute disgrace. In fact, it's a sham. It's a sham that he can stand here and pretend to support it when really out there he's white-anting and undermining the measures that we're taking and putting in place to ensure that the people who support and serve our community on the front line are safe and have measures in place to protect them if people decide to take violent actions against them. Disgrace. But of course we shouldn't be surprised by this, Mr Acting Speaker. We shouldn't be surprised by this because being soft on law and order and community safety is in the Labor Party's DNA. It's in the Labor Party's DNA. And I say that, Mr Acting Speaker, because I did a little bit of research. I did a little bit of research, Member for Albany. You might want to listen. And in doing so, I obtained some documents under FOI, under Freedom of Information. And they refer to Labor Cabinet documents, Mr Acting Speaker, and it makes for some very interesting reading. So I'm just going to refer to these documents, and it's a strategy for reducing the rate and cost of imprisonment. And it is, I quote, the recommendation that the Cabinet, the Labor Cabinet, endorse the overall strategy outlined in this submission. And I'm going to go into some detail of this submission, Mr Acting Speaker. As I said, though, it makes for some very interesting reading. And there was three components to what the Labor Party was trying to do when it comes to this initiative, remembering it was endorsed by Cabinet. And that was the first aspect was the exercise of the royal prerogative of mercy. Now for people who don't know, for members who don't know, this is a measure which is held by the Governor of the day and is applied to the early release of prisoners in exceptional circumstances or on compassionate grounds, Mr Acting Speaker. So that's what it's there for. I'll repeat that. The release of prisoners in exceptional circumstances on compassionate grounds. However, and it's right here in black and white, in Labor Party's own Cabinet document, they say the remission, they wanted to roll this royal prerogative of mercy out across the entire prison population, Mr Acting Speaker. So you're starting to get a gist of how tough they are on law and order and community safety. So people who have committed crimes, these aren't people who have just been caught with their hand in the cookie jar, Mr Acting Speaker. These people who have been committed crimes and been sentenced. The Labor Party wanted to remit their sentences to the tune of 30 days and release them to freedom. It goes on to say, all prisoners who become eligible for parole within a specific 12-month period be made eligible for parole release 30 days early. It then goes on to say, the sentences of those received within a specific 12-month period who have been sentenced to a term of imprisonment of 6 months or less and have served 50% of their sentence, including those sentenced for driving offences, be remitted and the prisoners released to freedom. So that's 3 months off. 3 months off for some certain offenders, Mr Acting Speaker. And it's interesting when we go through and we read some remarks from the Leader of the Opposition with regards to spending time behind bars and in prison. And this is an extract from Hansard on Wednesday the 11th of June last year. The Leader of the Opposition, so scared of prison he is. I spent a couple of hours touring through the various cell blocks parts of Hakea Prison. I spent 2 hours there. The thought that I might spend longer than that is an appalling thought. Yes, he's starting to catch on. He goes on to say, to actually go and see the prison up close in operation has been one of the more interesting things I've done recently. I realised when I went there that it is neither a nice place nor a good place to be. You don't say. It is not somewhere that anybody would really want to be if they did not have to be there. You don't say. And if they are there, they would not want to be there a minute longer than they absolutely have to be. Of course, it's a deterrent, Mr Acting Speaker. You put penalties in place so that people, A, don't commit the crime. If they do commit the crime, then they know what's going to happen to them. Mr Acting Speaker, here we have in black and white. Heard enough from you, member, heard enough from you. And here we go on to see that they're releasing them for 30 days across the entire prison population. Or in some cases, if they're really generous, 3 months. Mr Acting Speaker, it goes on to say on the same page of this Cabinet submission, same page, under the heading Risks, bolded, Risks, government could be criticised for using the royal prerogative of mercy in the way proposed since it is usually only applied to the early release of prisoners in exceptional circumstances on compassionate grounds. It goes on to say some released prisoners could reoffend, perhaps seriously. But let's not let that get in the way. The second part of this Cabinet submission, Mr Acting Speaker, related to administrative change. And this makes for some very interesting reading too. So they wanted to introduce discretion by supervising community-based services to reduce the number of parolees returned to prison for non-compliance with the conditions of their orders. And I sit here and listen to the member...
Yes? Member for Cannington.
I'm just trying to ascertain whether the member is misleading the House. He says that he has obtained a document under FOI, and he then says it's a Cabinet submission. My understanding of FOI laws is you cannot get Cabinet submissions under FOI.
Happy to clarify that, Mr Acting Speaker.
I don't think that's a point of order. Members, points of order to be heard in silence. A member for Cannington, my advice is that that's not a point of order. Thanks. A member for Forrestfield.
The member about that. Cabinet documents older than 10 years are accessible under FOI. So do your homework first, champ. Anyway, getting on to the administrative change.
A point of order. I'm seeking to understand how the Cabinet submission from 10 years ago relates to the debate on the particular provision. Perhaps the member can explain to the House whether this matter relates to the substance of the matter that we're debating, which is respect of home burglaries, or whether the document that he claims to have got from FOI relates to a matter that's not related to...
Member, that's not a point of
well,
order.
It is
it's indicated already.
What I've asked, Mr Speaker, Acting Speaker, is whether the document he's quoting from relates to the question of home burglaries, and perhaps the member could let us know that.
Member, I've said it's not a point of order. I expect you to respect
that. Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I'll continue. Anyway, second part...
Albany.
Second part, Mr Acting Speaker, goes on to talk about administrative change, and I said they wanted to introduce discretion by supervising community-based services to reduce the number of parolees returned to prison for non-compliance with the conditions of their orders. And I sit here and listen to the member for Warnbro bang on and on about TJD and how appalled he is, and yet his own party wanted to release him. And in fact, it goes on to say a broader interpretation of the term minimum risk may need legislative change. Their own risk statement.
Members. Members.
Mr Acting Speaker.
Members, I'm on my feet. Members. Member for Cannington, I'm on my feet and I expect you to be silent, and everyone else as well. I have to call you next time. Member for,
did he withdraw? He called me a liar.
Member Forrestfield, is there a point of order, is it? What? Member for Canning. Here. Member for Cannington. If that's what you said, I asked you to withdraw. Thank you.
Very good. Anyway, I'll continue. So it goes on to say, for the implementation of this, that a broader interpretation of the term minimum risk may need legislative change. And again, in their own risk statement, where it, bolded risk, it goes on to say the number of breaches of early release orders could increase, thereby drawing adverse community comment. Again, demonstrating their tough approach to law and order and community safety. And Mr Acting Speaker, the third part of this document goes on to talk about legislative change, specifically to target offenders who currently would receive sentences of imprisonment of less than 2 years. Well, we've already established that the Leader of the Opposition is scared of spending a second longer than he needs to in prison or behind bars, and yet the Labor Party was pushing to target offenders who currently receive sentences of imprisonment of less than 2 years. Specifically with regard to traffic offences.
Members, can we have a little shush on this side, thanks?
Specifically with regards to traffic offences, Mr Acting Speaker, and provide for management in the community of these offenders. And I challenge the Labor Party. I challenge them that they come out to my electorate and they speak to Deb and Graham Harris, who had a drunken driver smash through the front of their home over the Australia Day long weekend two Australia Days ago, and come out and tell them that it's okay for that guy just to walk scot-free without being held to account, Mr Acting Speaker.
Driving has got nothing to do with any clause of this bill. Drunk or reckless or any other clause. Otherwise we could have had a good examination of Mr Buswell in detail. I would have liked to have done that, but it wasn't relevant to the bill. What's crashing a car into a house got to do with this bill?
Member for Butler, the second reading allows for a fairly broad canvassing of the issues, and the member for Forrestfield is canvassing the whole issue of tough on crime, and I certainly rule that is an issue that's related to that.
Broad and shallow. Broad and shallow.
Anyway, they don't like the truth, Mr Acting Speaker. They don't like the truth. The only thing I could suggest that's probably more un-Australian than the fact that they would let drunk drivers go free is perhaps this Cabinet submission in the first place, Mr Acting Speaker. They go on to say that they enable the court to impose... Keep rabbiting on. Enable the court to impose... They don't like it when they hear the truth, Mr Acting Speaker. An order of suspended imprisonment. An order of suspended imprisonment. Given this option, courts may be willing to order suspended imprisonment where they currently imprison for 24 months or less. Mr Acting Speaker, their own risk statement yet again goes on to say that the police and community may question the appropriateness of the proposal relating to driving offences. Well, Mr Acting Speaker, I went on to have a look at what kind of offences draw a sentence of 2 years or less. And the kinds of people that, if Labor were in charge, would be walking our streets. And I just want to take a few moments to go through these, because they make for some compelling reading. So, went to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and looked at the length of custody in a correctional institution in Western Australia for last financial year. And they've got a range of categories, Mr Acting Speaker, so I just want to go through them. Homicide and related offences, the people you take home to meet your mum. 6. That's 6 people receiving sentences just under 2 years or less. Acts intended to cause injury, 754. Behind bars, what would Labor have them do? Walking the streets. Sexual assault and related offences, 83. Behind bars, what would Labor have them do? Walking the streets. Dangerous or negligent acts endangering persons, 233. Behind bars, what would Labor do? Have them walking the streets. Abduction, harassment or other offences against the person, 50. Behind bars, Labor on the streets. Robbery, extortion or related offences, stand-up individuals, 127. Labor would have them walking the streets. Unlawful entry with intent, which perhaps is closest related to this legislation, Mr Acting Speaker, 530. 530. With Labor in control, walking the streets. Theft and related offences, 184. Walking the streets. Fraud, can I get an extension, Mr Acting Speaker?
Extension granted.
Thank you. Fraud, deception and related offences, 95. Labor, walking the streets. Illicit drug offences, 176. Labor, walking the streets. Prohibited and regulated weapons and explosive offences, that's very creative, 26. Under Labor, walking the streets. Property damage and environmental pollution. I'm sure the member for Goslers would be heartbroken by these ones. 64, walking the streets. Public order offences, 34, walking the streets. Traffic and vehicle regulatory offences, 314, walking the streets. Offences against justice, I'll get to you in a minute. Offences against justice, 160, walking the streets under Labor. Miscellaneous offences, apparently they don't fit into any of these categories, Mr Acting Speaker, 6 under Labor, walking the streets. Total, 2,842, and that's your stance, being tough on law and order and community safety. Disgrace. Disgrace. And you know what, Mr Acting Speaker? Possibly the most telling part of this entire Cabinet document. The Minister for Police at the time was none other than the member for Midland. The member for Midland, the person who would call herself the Police Minister under a Labor government. And yet she comes in here, she tries to get...
Member for Midland?
The member for Forrestfield has said that he's got an official document under FOI. I'd call him to lay that document on the table for the remainder of the day's sitting so that we can see what he's referring to, because it's certainly not a document authored by myself if that's what he's now intending to imply.
My discretion whether I do that.
Member for... members...
Or a mouth. Table it if you've got any guts.
Members, it's the discretion of the member
I'm actually referring
as to whether he wishes to lay it on the table.
So, anyway... The police minister at the time was the shadow police minister, the member for Midland, who pipes up. She's finding her voice now. You know what, member for Midland, you'd actually make a good case study in how to turn a safe Labor seat into one of the most marginal in the Southern Hemisphere. You know, and you're like a Klingon. You're like a Klingon. You're like a... Did you know your own staff...
Point of order.
Point of order. Member for Forrestfield. Member for Canning.
I understood what you were saying previously, Mr Speaker, and I'm not seeking to canvass any of those matters, but I'm not quite sure what the ridiculous comments of the member for Forrestfield have to do with the bill. And I would appreciate if you could ensure that the member for Forrestfield adheres to the standing orders by making his remarks related to the bill.
Member for Forrestfield, I would encourage you to
and Mr Acting Speaker, I'm just giving some historical account here, and the fact that they come in here and pretend to be tough on law and order, and yet the person who wants to be police minister in this state was police minister at the time and was sat in this cabinet room, and when they think no one is listening, behind the closed doors of cabinet, their true colours come out, and now 10 years later, we can see it in black and white. It's a disgrace. You're a disgrace. You have no credibility.
Members.
No credibility.
Members.
Point of order.
Point of order.
The member in question is making an unsubstantiated attack on my integrity, and I would call upon him to table whatever document he's referring to. Let us see what the document is.
Leave it on the table.
Lay it on the table for the remainder of today's sitting.
Member, that's not a point of order.
Sorry, I'm not the subject of this bill, Mr Speaker, so I fail to see how his comments are remotely pertinent to the bill other than by way of personal insult to me.
Member for Midland, that's not a point of order. People variously attack the integrity of members and so on. That's part of the cut and thrust of the debate. And so, a new point of order.
I draw your attention to the use of the term, "you are a disgrace," by the member for Forrestfield to the member for Midland. That is clearly...
Member for Albany, we hear points of order in silence.
Indeed, Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to be heard in silence. That comment by the member for Forrestfield is clearly unparliamentary, and in accordance with the standing orders, I ask you to enforce them and make him withdraw.
Members, my recollection is that the word "you're a disgrace" is bandied around this place rather very frequently.
And Mr Acting Speaker, if it helps the sensitivities of members opposite, I'll say the actions of members opposite were a disgrace. Anyway, I think, Mr Acting Speaker, I've made the point that the wannabe police minister presided over this disgraceful document.
Presiding over this document. I've asked him whether I'm the author of it. I've asked him whether he's prepared to lay it on the table. I don't think you can let him continue to impugn my character in this way without him actually substantiating it with the actual document.
Member for Butler, we hear points of order in silence. Thank you. I don't believe that's a point of order. Member for Forrestfield.
Thank you. And it's interesting hearing the member for Butler referring to me as a coward when out of this chamber he refers to mandatory sentencing as bull ... I think it's very clear that when there's no cameras, when there's no media, when they think there's no public scrutiny, the true colours of the WA Labor Party come to the fore, and we see how insipid they are, how soft on law and order they are, and how they're always angling for the criminal vote. But, you know, that shouldn't come as a surprise either, Mr Acting Speaker, when you look at some of the people who have held Labor membership, like former Labor Premier Brian Burke, who also has...
Point of order.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Member for Butler. The member
I,
for Midland's on the feet for a point of
order.
order.
I seek your ruling on whether or not it is parliamentary for the member for Forrestfield to say that we are always angling for the criminal vote, whether that is acceptable to you as Speaker presiding in this House.
It's an opinion that the members express. I don't believe that's a point of order.
Speaker. Mr Acting Speaker, I just wish that maybe someone opposite, rather than listening to the faceless union officials, should perhaps listen to the people of Western Australia and stand up for the vast majority of law-abiding mums and dads who go about their business day in, day out, doing the right thing, and yet they're as soft as butter when it comes to law and order and community safety. Mr Speaker, I'll conclude my remarks by saying this. I fully support this legislation that targets criminals. I want Western Australians to feel safe in their houses, whether it be in my electorate or across the state. I want them to feel safe in their homes. And, Mr Speaker, that's why when I speak to families...
what was that noise?
That's why when I get around and listen to my constituents, Mr Acting Speaker, that tell me about some of the things that concern them, I want to be here representing them in the Parliament to make sure that this legislation is passed and that we do introduce these measures to protect people in their homes. Mr Speaker, that's why I commend this legislation to the House. Thank you.
Member for